Right, I am going to start because it looks as if I've got two viewers. We're having some problems here with the streaming, but it would be great if anyone out there can tell me whether they're able to sort of hear what I'm saying. So this is a hangout for something that we've been wanting to do for a while, which is an overview on some of the tricky and problematic contents that can happen in a community in Health Unlocked. Just to introduce myself, I'm Matt Jameson Evans. I'm the co-founder and Chief Medical Officer of Health Unlocked. So I tend to get involved with some of the less than straightforward content. That's because really it's a health platform, and as we all know, a lot of health information can be, difficult, less than straightforward. The context matters a lot, and when you're dealing with a huge community, that can matter. So the culture of the community is really the key, and managing tricky or problematic content is really part of maintaining the culture and building the culture to sort of help and support as many people as possible. And what we're at Health Unlocked we're trying to do is really to build the technology to try and help the people who run the communities, all of our partners, to foster and develop the culture that can be supported. So this is really not much more than a short kind of overview and a discussion of what can happen when there can be a cultural clash, or when different types of information cannot really be supported by the community or can be conflicted with the community. And so the journey really starts with the features that we put in, which is when there's a piece of problematic content, usually what happens is that there's a report this post to the platform. And I'm just going to talk about the kind of different areas that those reports generate. So one that we would call anti-cultural behavior. So in the report feature, that's a label that's either personal abuse, trolling, or offensive language. Then we're going to talk a bit about spam, which is another report, which spam and advertising. And then the third bit we're going to talk about is a little bit about what happens when medical advice or medical events happen within the platform, for which obviously we're not really capable of dealing with those things. So there's a fairly blanket rule in Health Unlocked that anything that involves either direct medical advice or medical events happening live in the platform, that's not what the platform's set up for, and that's obviously a problem. So I'm going to start off with what we call anti-cultural behavior, and I think it's probably something that anyone who runs a community in Health Unlocked is familiar with. It's anything from the most slightly offensive language that might not sort of resonate with everyone, to more inappropriate comments that again can be sort of problematic for different people or for everybody in the platform, to the spectrum of much more kind of what people talk about in the media, which is the sort of malicious activity in communities that's often called trolling. And first of all, I think it's important to think about the singularity of something like an online community, of why these conflicts can happen and what are the causes. And I think there are a few different reasons. A big part of it is the distance that people feel. They feel a complete distance from the actual difference of speaking to someone in a room, and that's in the same way as people behave differently inside the confines of a car. That distance often releases sort of the ability to behave differently. The other thing is really the relationships in communities, some of which can be incredibly strong and very real, and sort of actually a lot of people in Health Unlocked get together and meet up and offline. But a lot of them, it's a much more abstract relationship that, again, fosters different types of behavior. The third reason that we see for sort of anti-cultural behavior is communication and the huge potentiality of miscommunicating in an online context. And the fourth is really the cultural differences between different groups of people in the platform. But I think apart from the actual harm that cultural conflict can create within a community between individuals, it's also, if it's not managed properly, something that can actually affect really the whole of the community and drive a community downhill. That's why it's sort of an important thing, I think, to have for anyone who's managing a community, to have an approach to how it's managed. And that's kind of what we kind of want to start here. We want to get more information from you about your experiences of managing problematic context. Why is it so complicated? I think particularly going back to the context of each individual person who forms part of the community, we know that there's a huge spectrum of different types of people that use Health Unlocked, and that might be a spectrum from different languages. There's a lot of non-English people who use English-speaking platforms, but also within health, there's a huge range of psychological sort of impacts of, as well as psychological illnesses, but also body illnesses that have a psychological component. And there's a lot of social and physical differences between different groups of people on the platform. And so it's almost a hotbed of potential conflict just from misunderstanding. But notwithstanding that, our kind of approach to how this is managed as a technology is really just a sort of step-by-step approach to these different situations. So if we take personal abuse or bad language or something that causes offence to someone else, the vast majority of that kind of activity is dealt with by first a report, usually by someone in the community that reports that situation. That generates a report to the administrator of the community, you guys. And I think at that point, you follow a protocol which is really fairly straightforward. It's pretty much always got to be a judgment call. It's a human judgment call. We can't really create a machine yet that understands the nuances of human interaction as we can ourselves. So first of all, is it objectively harmful to the individual who's generated the report or who's affected by this abuse? Then the second thing is it objectively harmful to the community itself, to the wider community? And if as an administrator you can say yes to any one of those, I think the next step is to say, well, what's the previous history? So we can look at the user's previous history and decide, is this a pattern of behavior or is it a one-off? And from that, the action can be created about, is this something that just can be managed, even let go? Does it need a little bit of interaction with with one or both of the parties? And then if it's more severe, does the user need to be restricted from that community? And at that point, we, Health Unlocked, can also decide whether it's a wider problem and actually that user can be banned and all the context can be eliminated from the system. Because I think the common interest is that we want to support the individuals within the platform, but even above that, we want to minimize the risk of any one individual diverting a community away from its natural cultural course. So that's sort of the approach to something like personal abuse, and we basically use a very similar approach to the other types. So on that issue of going across the spectrum down to sort of the trolling behavior, again, we have to decide, is it harmful to the individual? Is it harmful to the community? What's the previous history? And then take that action of either feeding back, restricting, or then banning. I think it's worth saying a little bit about trolling at this point, or kind of actively malicious behavior, which fortunately we see very rarely, but we have seen, and we have seen it's done in various different ways. there's a kind of little bit of research that's been done around, well, there's plenty of research that's been done about trolls, but they really subdivide into 2 or 3 different groups. One is what they call playtime trolls, where it's really just really stupid behavior. It's often just short and malicious behavior, which is actually very easy to spot. And our approach is just to completely ban them from the community straight off. The second one is tactical trolls. We've seen this very rarely. It's actually where people take the game much more seriously and actually create a credible persona and often post content that appears to be completely within the cultural frame of the community, but then gets very subtle ways of creating disturbing kind of nuances to their content. And that can be a very different judgment call about what that involves. And then there's an even worse type of troll called strategic troll, which is a group effort to take over a platform. And thankfully, we've never seen any of that in the platform. But I think it's something that we would welcome any input from you, the administrators and partners of Health Unlocked, if you've had any feeling of any experience of that kind of malicious behavior within the platform. But I think the thumbnail guide to dealing with it is really primarily judgment on whether it's harmful to the individual or harmful to the community. Secondly, the previous history, and third, taking the action. And that pretty much applies to, I think, a lot of the approaches that we would advise on managing with difficult content. So the second part that I'm going to talk about now is really around spam and advertising. And I know we've had a lot, I think through the last few years, we've had really good feedback from both users and administrators of Health Unlocked about spam when it comes up. We get reports of spam, regularly, which is really useful. Out of that, I think some of you were aware of an attack that we had at the beginning of this year, where there was suddenly this huge volume of spam in certain communities, personal messaging done kind of at a machine level. It was something we hadn't experienced before. But as a result of that, and with discussions with some of you, we implemented a technology called a Kismet, which really works out based around some of the text, the IP addresses, and what devices they're using, looking for patterns on that, and actually shutting down the spam before it sort of takes that kind of machine level of activity. So that's one technology that we use to make spam kind of less likely to be a serious problem. The other one is more of an algorithm that we use, and we call it Sirius, and it really relates to the pattern of activity of a typical type of spam. So we can set a threshold of, say, the number of private messages or the number of responses following the creation of a new account, and if it exceeds a certain threshold, it generates a warning response to us, and then if it actually exceeds another threshold, it gets an instant ban. So again, if someone comes on when we're not at full power over a weekend, it really provides a sort of way of limiting that activity. So in March, actually we had, over the whole of March, we had about 182 accounts that were identified by Sirius, this capability as spammers. That went down to 57 in April, and then we get maybe 1 or 2 accounts every 3 or 4 days that are flagged up as spam. And we think about 90% of the spammers are caught by this technology. So we still do rely on user feedback for spam and commercial advertising against our terms and conditions. But again, we welcome any thoughts that you have about personal experiences with unwanted content in the platform. So the last bit I'm going to talk about is really one of the reasons I'm kind of giving this webinar is close to my heart, because it's the situations of having medical situations, medical advice, in the platform. Something that when we set up the platform, we were clear about what we wanted to do, and it was not to be in any way replacing any part of the kind of medical pathway. It was actually to complement the medical pathway. So we have a very strict rule, which really is that no medical advice should really be given on the platform. And certainly if there's a situation where something acute, something immediate is happening, that advice at that point is something that should only be given in a kind of capable context, i.e. a clinical context. So that's the fairly sort of black and white rule that we have. I'm going to talk a little bit about a particular type of situation which we put a bit more work into thinking through, and that's medical situations which involve discussion or threats of self-harm, or up to the level of suicidal content. And as I said before, because there's such a strong psychological component in a lot of physical illnesses, the issue around things like self-harm content is really sort of not just limited to some of the mental health communities that we have. So, and because it's so important, we actually have a sort of a link direct to the protocol of self-harm or suicidal posts that is a link that's available to all the administrators when a report base comes through. In many ways, the management of self-harm or risky mental health content is a judgment call which is equally complex as some of the nuances of abuse or reporting around inappropriate behaviour. It's a judgment call that is mostly a human one. But we put together a framework which is really just an aid memoir about how you might approach this. And I think in many ways it follows the same approach, which is when you're looking at a post which is either discussing self-harm, things like cutting oneself, or suicidal thoughts, or actually the intention to commit suicide. The best approach, from having discussed with other mental health charities that are part of the platform, is to assess the risk to the user. So is it an actual thought about self-harm? Is it just in the context of another completely different situation? Is it real? Are you worried about it? Then not only that is assessing the risk to others, because it's important to understand that the whole platform potentially have also a very difficult situation that they might be going through, and this might be a damaging bit of content to them. And then the action really, for whether it's any medical advice or suicidal posts, would be to have a very low threshold of removing the content, deleting it, and then messaging that user individually with the support information that actually we provide, but at a global level needs to be specific to the country, just to seek medical advice, to provide support services that are actually capable of managing and supporting people who are going through a crisis, and then to make sure also that the community is aware that action was taken for that person. And that really is the principle. I would encourage you, if you want to look at this in any more detail, to look at a document that we'll be posting up after this webinar, but that is also available in the admin section, in the report section. And we will be reviewing this document every 6 months. As I said, it's not a prescription of how you should manage every individual case, but what it is a framework from which you might be able to take some guidelines on how to approach these things. So I'm actually completely blind to the comments that are being created. So we've got a few people. I'm just looking at the comments. Excuse me for just taking a time to have a look at this. Wonderful. So I'm seeing that Ruth Grossart from NRAS wasn't aware of this protocol. We have actually advertised that, and actually it's clearly we need to probably do a bit better to reinforce that. It's a document that's actually pretty sort of close to my heart, because I think it's part of the complexity of managing online health communities is that they're very different from other types of community, and they have specific situations. So we will be building on that document, not just about self-harm, but also some of these other issues that come out of managing health communities online that I've talked about today. So that hopefully we'll put more effort into making that more widely available and known. So Louise has asked, and this is a question about, in future, will we be able to close threads to further comments? And I'll just widen that. Closing threads is one of the most commonly asked for features by admins. So, but beyond that, there's other reasons that we need to be able to sort of close threads and actually stop comments. Some is when users pass away, and it can be distressing if they get further comments in a post to their loved ones. So the short answer is yes, we are going to provide that functionality. When we can do that is something that I can't give you the answer today, but I think we've talked about before a better admin dashboard of how to manage your users, and that you will have some control over things like restricting and actually limiting responses and things like that on particular users in the future. As you know, we've done a lot of reorganization. There are changes coming down the line that are happening every week or every couple of weeks. What I can say is that there isn't going to be a big bang change in the interface now. It should just be getting better bit by bit. And so we can focus on these issues like closing threads and like making the management of users a little bit easier for admins, because we focus a lot on making the platform a little bit more usable, which I can promise you it will evolve into now. But actually the kind of tools for admins haven't changed a huge amount for a few years now, and it is one of our big priorities to make the management of communities for admins easier, more enjoyable, more insightful, and more rewarding. So we look forward to sort of bringing that to you. We seem to have had. Sorry, I'm going to another computer now again to look at these questions. I think unless anyone's got any further questions, that's probably it for today. I'm very happy. I'm aware I'm not the best at using kind of webinar technology, and Simone, who usually sets this up, is actually away at a communities management day, which actually is discussing a lot of the things that we've been talking about. So apologies for not being really slick about the webinar. But yes, we've got another comment from Louise, which is we need more heads up for upcoming changes. We will try and do that a little bit more in advance. So thanks for your comments. Please feel free to message me about anything that's come out of this webinar. Anyone looking at this that's not live, please feel free to email me at matt@healthandlonk.com. I'll pass any of the comments through to the team. All of the feedback is always useful, and particularly on this stuff about difficult content. We know how much of a headache it can be for admins. We've kind of learned a lot over the last 2 or 3 years about how to do things a little bit better, how we'd like things to look in the future, but it always helps to have people who are actually dealing with the reality of lots of different types of information and putting that information in our grasp. So thanks very much. I will now try and close this down.